Network. We're coming to you live on Facebook as we cover the Senate confirmation hearings underway for Donald Trump's cabinet picks. First up is Alabama Senator Jeff Sessions, who Trump has tapped for Attorney General. He was Trump's earliest and one of his most vocal supporters in the Senate. He's expected to be confirmed, but that hasn't stopped what seemed like an endless stream of protesters from disrupting the hearing. Well, now joining us to discuss this is Gerald Horne. He's the John J. and Rebecca Morse Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, author of many books, most recently, The Counter-Revolution of 1776, Slave Resistance, and the Origins of the United States of America. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Jeff Sessions spent a good deal of time today defending his history and his record on civil rights, which is significant because in 1986, Republicans joined with Democrats to block him from becoming a federal judge after allegations of racism surfaced from his colleagues. To counter these claims today, he cited his prosecution of civil rights activists when he was U.S. Attorney to Alabama in the 1980s. They were registering elderly black voters. We're going to play the clip, and then we'll play news coverage from 1986 that discusses that case. Here's that clip.
Let me address another issue straight on. I was accused in 1986 of failing to protect the voting rights of African Americans by presenting the Perry County case, the voter fraud case, and of condemning civil rights advocates and organizations, and even harboring, amazingly, sympathies for the KKK. These are damnably false charges. The voter fraud case my office prosecuted was in response to pleas from African-American incumbent elected officials who claimed that the absentee ballot process involved a situation in which ballots cast for them were stolen, altered, and cast for their opponents.
His biggest problem came in a case he prosecuted and lost, a vote fraud case involving black civil rights leaders in Perry County, Alabama. Defendants in the Perry County case were Albert and Evelyn Turner, political and civil rights leaders for more than 20 years. Albert was an aide to Martin Luther King. Their scrapbook has all the marches.
This is Bloody Sunday. Albert, you can see that's him right there.
Albert Turner guided the mules at Dr. King's funeral. The federal government charged the Turners with doctoring absentee ballots, vote fraud, and mail fraud.
My own opinion is that the case was political. I actually don't think Jeff Sessions and them came in with an ounce of evidence.
Okay, so to recap, Jeff Sessions says he's a defender of civil rights, of voting rights, because he prosecuted the Turners who were registering elderly black voters in Alabama in the 80s. Gerald Horne, give us your response to this.
Well, obviously, Jeff Sessions' response is a case of opportunism. It reminds me of the vice presidential debate with Mike Pence and the Democratic candidate Tim Kaine, where Mike Pence basically denied reality and denied truths. And apparently that worked, since now he's the vice president-elect of the United States of America. Jeff Sessions has copied that playbook and feels that this will lead to its confirmation as the U.S. Attorney General. It's rather disconcerting to look at the New York Times headline and see that according to their reporter, the Democrats did not land a glove on Jeff Sessions, which is quite unfortunate because that voting rights case is enough to sink his nomination. Keep in mind—
And it actually was part of why he wasn't a federal judge in '86, why Republicans joined with Democrats. It was a Republican-controlled committee that blocked him from being a federal judge.
Yeah, basically what happened was that Albert Turner was helping some voters fill out an absentee ballot. Some of these voters reputedly had problems in terms of reading these ballots, and to prosecute Mr. Turner and try to put him in jail for such assistance is beyond the pale. In the New York Times this morning, in fact, the wife of Mr. Turner has now passed away. She said that Jeff Sessions came up to her recently and tried to explain and tried to hug her, and she basically chased him away. And I think that the Democrats and other senators of goodwill should chase him away from that hearing room and make sure he is not confirmed as the next Attorney General of the United States.
Well, he's certainly been facing what seems like an endless barrage of protests. There was a moment where protesters with Code Pink actually dressed up in KKK hoods to confront him about his past. And you know, I was watching the hearings on C-SPAN, and the president of the NAACP also expressed his frustration that you know, Sessions, who was a senator, member of the same committee, was treated with such deference. He wasn't really challenged very often on his record. There was a moment where he was challenged, though, by Senator Al Franken. He questioned Sessions about several civil rights cases that Sessions claims to have worked on as, again, U.S. Attorney to Alabama. I want to play a clip of that questioning, and I actually was able to track down one of the lawyers that did work on those cases, Mr. Gerald Horne, who was a Department of Justice lawyer at the time, and he actually testified in Sessions' hearing in 1986. And he says Sessions wasn't being truthful, and that's why him and several of his Department of Justice colleagues wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post last week, which went viral. Here's that exchange.
Last week, I should note, 3 attorneys who worked at DOJ and who actually brought 3 of the 4 cases wrote an op-ed piece in which they say, quote, "We can state categorically that Sessions had no substantive involvement in any of them." Now, you originally said that you personally handled 3 of these cases, but these lawyers say that you had no substantive involvement. Chairman Grassley, I would ask that op-ed from last Tuesday's Washington Post be entered into the record.
Without objection, it will be entered.
Are they distorting your record here?
Yes. In fact, one of the writers there, Mr. Hebert, spent a good bit of time in my office. He said I supported him in all the cases he brought, that I was more supportive than almost any other U.S. attorney, and that I provided office space. I signed the complaints that he brought. And as you know, may know, Senator Franken, when a lawyer signs a complaint, he's required to affirm that he believes in that complaint and supports that complaint and supports that legal action.
We looked at that list, and 3 or 4 of those cases were ones that we handled personally when we were at the Justice Department. And we knew he didn't really have any involvement substantively in any of those cases. So we felt that the Senate colleagues that he has, who are on the Judiciary Committee, as well as members of the public, ought to know that he really can't be taking credit for other people's work.
So that was that exchange with Senator Franken questioning Jeff Sessions about his claims that he worked on those cases, and Sessions saying, no, Mr. Hebert, you know, he thinks highly of me. You know, I supported his work. And then my interview with Gerald Hebert saying, absolutely not, that is not the case. So this is a clear example of Sessions fabricating history to change his track record on civil rights, to make it more appealing and to make it easier, I guess, for his confirmation. Your response, Professor Horne?
Well, it reminds me of heavyweight boxing champion Joe Louis, who more than 7 decades ago was fighting Billy Conn. And Joe Louis's message to Billy Conn is, you can run, but you can't hide. Jeff Sessions may be able to run from his record temporarily, but he cannot hide from his record, which is a human rights and civil rights debacle. Keep in mind that Jeff Sessions is on record as denying the notion of birthright citizenship, which is embedded in the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. In other words, the 14th Amendment says if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen of the United States. Because Jeff Sessions is so anti-immigrant, and because, like his boss, Donald J. Trump, he accepts the fallacious notion of so-called anchor babies, that is to say, women and other women coming into the United States in order to have a baby so that somehow they can get a leg up into getting rights as U.S. nationals, or at least mothers of U.S. nationals. Because he accepts such fallacies, he's willing to mangle and do violence to the Constitution of the United States of America and the 14th Amendment more specifically. He's also very hostile to LGBT rights. He's anti-immigrant, as noted. He's anti-working class in terms of his denial of the right of workers to get a living wage. He should be rejected by the U.S. Senate.
Another stance he's taken is he has come out on record and opposed the Voting Rights Act, which the Supreme Court gutted just a few years ago. And we've seen the reports of massive voter disenfranchisement across the country, hundreds of thousands of people not being able to vote. We've seen more than a dozen states limit voting, the ability to vote, which disproportionately target African American and people of color. And now you're going to have Jeff Sessions, who actually prosecuted people for registering people to vote, as the Attorney General, defending the right to vote. What is that going to mean for the ability for this country to have the semblance of a fair election in the future?
Well, it makes the possibility of a fair election in the United States of America basically a nullity, null and void, a joke, a travesty. It would be as if you were appointing the wolf to guard the henhouse if Jeff Sessions, as Attorney General, has the authority to supervise Voting Rights Act regulation and, in fact, to make sure that the Voting Rights Act, even as gutted, is still not removed from the books altogether. Once again, it's very disappointing to see that many of the Democratic senators are treating him as if he were a valued colleague, as opposed to treating him as the civil rights and constitutional rights outlaw that he actually is.
And so another thing that's of concern to people around the country, and for example in Baltimore, is that Jeff Sessions has he supports quote unquote law and order, and he's come out specifically against consent decrees. That's when the federal government, Department of Justice, intervenes with local police departments, like we saw in Ferguson and again right here in Baltimore, when the actions of the local police are so egregious that, as in the Baltimore's case, that DOJ lawyers found a pattern and practice of routine constitutional violation of civil and human rights by the police force, especially on the African American population. And that's something Baltimore's tackled for a long time. The local authorities can't seem to get a grip on it, so the feds have intervened. And in Baltimore's case, if that consent decree is not to a federal judge by the time Trump takes office, it's likely going to mean that there will be no consent decree here, that things will go back to the way they were. Talk about what a Donald Trump presidency and a Jeff Sessions Attorney General could mean for law enforcement across the country.
Well, not only is what you're saying relevant to Baltimore, recall a few years ago that Tamir Rice, a young black boy, was killed on tape by Cleveland police officers. There was no viable prosecution of those police officers. The Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department intervened, just like the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department intervened with regard to Ferguson, Missouri, in the aftermath a few years ago of the slaying of Michael Brown. If Jeff Sessions becomes the U.S. Attorney General, you can kiss goodbye the idea of the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department intervening in cases where young black boys and men have been killed by the police. This could lead to a further epidemic of such police slayings, and obviously this is too ghastly to contemplate. And
Professor Horne, you've studied and documented U.S. history, since its inception, done some of the leading work on those issues. How do you place the moment we're in a historical context, with a Trump presidency and someone like Jeff Sessions, who was deemed too racially insensitive to be a federal judge 30 years ago to now be our next Attorney General?
Well, what's interesting is that Reverend William Barber of Moral Monday's fame in North Carolina, the head of the NAACP in that state, has suggested that we're going through the third Reconstruction and the birth pangs of the third Reconstruction. He's referring to the first Reconstruction after the abolishing of slavery, post-1865, the second Reconstruction in the 1960s, culminating, as you noted, with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He says that we're now on the verge of a third Reconstruction. But in fact, with all due respect to Reverend Barber, what seems to be unfolding with this pending appointment of Jeff Sessions is the overthrow of the second Reconstruction of the 1960s. Just like the first Reconstruction, post-1865, was overthrown in 1877. Now, in 2017, we see, 140 years later, that we're on the verge of the overthrow of the second Reconstruction, but it's not too late to prevent that result from taking place. I salute the protesters, I salute Code Pink, but obviously we will need much more if Jeff Sessions is to be denied the appointment to be the next Attorney General of the United States of America.
All right, Gerald Horne, thank you so much for joining us. We want to thank you all for joining us on Facebook. We will continue our ongoing coverage of the confirmation hearings of Jeff Sessions' cabinet appointees and the Trump administration, including on Inauguration Day and beyond. Thank you so much for joining us.